Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The wormhole released me like something it didn't want. Transit always felt wrong. 4 years of campaigning against the Pole's dark fleet, jumping gate to gate across the void, and the sensation never settled into routine. One moment you're in the ship, systems nominal, the hull trembling against forces that shouldn't exist. The next moment you're somewhere else, and your body knows it skipped something. Time, maybe. Or whatever time is made of. I ran the post-transit checks while the stars reoriented outside the canopy. Shield integrity at 14%. The campaign had ground them down to nothing. Fusion rifle charged, but the power cell showing its age. Armor systems functional, barely. The golden residue of paracausal energy still traced along my gauntlets where I'd channeled it during the last engagement, 2 days ago by my count. 2 days since I'd burned through a Pole cruiser's hull with my bare hands and watched it come apart in the dark. Threshold should have been visible by now. I found it by the forge first. The artificial sun suspended above the city on its central spire, the only source of warmth on a dead world at the edge of settled space. The forge was supposed to be white gold, bright enough to cast hard shadows across the city's upper towers from 100 kilometers out. What I saw was red. A sullen, dim red, like iron cooling after the heat has left it. I tried threshold command on the standard frequency. Static. I cycled through the backup channels, the emergency bands, the encrypted lines reserved for parallax nights. Dead, all of them. Every frequency I'd used to report in after every transit for the last 4 years. My 4 years, anyway. For the city, time moved differently. That was the cost of wormhole travel. You'd leave for a campaign that lasted months on your clock and come back to find decades had passed in the city. Children you'd known were old men. Commanders you'd served under were buried in memorial vaults. The forge hadn't changed, though. The forge was engineered to outlast civilizations. The forge was not supposed to be red. I checked my ship's chronometer against the orbital beacons. The beacons were still transmitting. Automated systems don't care about politics or theology. And the timestamp they carried hit me like a wall. 1142 years of drift. I read the number, closed the display, opened it again. The number hadn't changed. I'd been gone for over 1,000 years. There was a procedure for temporal shock. The Order had trained us for it, back when the Order existed. Acknowledge the displacement. Assess the tactical situation. Proceed with the mission. I did all 3 in roughly that sequence, and if my hands paused over the flight controls for a few seconds longer than necessary, that was between me and the cockpit. I brought the ship down on an outer maintenance platform, high up on a residential tower, away from the main transit lanes. The platform was abandoned, docking clamps rusted in their housings, service lights dark. I powered down the engines and unsealed the hatch, and the first thing I noticed stepping out was how cold it was. This was a wet, invasive cold that found the gaps between my plates and pressed in, unlike the vacuum chill my armor handled without complaint. Then I saw the statues. 6 of them, standing in a row along the platform's railing, facing inward, as if they'd been watching for arriving ships. Human figures. A man with his arm raised mid-wave, a woman beside him, hands clasped at her waist, 4 others in various postures of waiting. All of them rendered in black glass, dark as a Pole cruiser's hull, so deep it seemed to drink the forge's weak light. And inside the glass something moved, a slow, trapped luminance that drifted through the figures' interiors like embers caught in resin. I knew what this was. Translation. The Pole's signature weapon, a phased transition that converted living matter into dark crystal. I'd seen it happen to enemy ships, to rubble, to the frozen wreckage that tumbled through the void after an engagement. I'd never seen it done to people standing on a balcony, arranged in a neat row, positioned like a welcome party. My first read was simple. The pole broke through while we were gone. The city fell. I unslung the fusion rifle and moved toward the tower's interior access. The corridor beyond the maintenance hatch was lit. Not well, but enough to navigate. The infrastructure was working. Power, climate systems, pressurization. Someone was maintaining this tower. The walls had been modified since I'd last been here. Panels of dark glass mounted at intervals, arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. Banners hanging from ceiling fixtures, black fabric printed with a sigil, a dark circle swallowing a white flame. It looked religious. It looked intentional. I heard him before I saw him. Footsteps, a tool bag clanking, the sounds of routine work. A man in maintenance coveralls rounded the corner ahead of me and stopped dead. He was in his 50s, stocky, carrying a diagnostic kit. He looked at my armor first, the plating, the paracausal traces on my gauntlets, and then at the fusion rifle. His face went the color of old paper. "Take it easy," I said. "I'm looking for Threshold Command. Where's the garrison?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the golden light along my gauntlets, the way a man stares at a lit fuse. "The garrison," I repeated. "Military command. Where is it?" "There's no garrison." His voice came out in a rush, words crowding each other. "There hasn't been. You can't be here. You're not real." "I'm real. Where is the military authority in this city?" "The wardens. The temple wardens. But you're a burner." He said the word like it tasted foul. "The firebringers. The old war. You're supposed to be gone. All of you. Gone." I lowered the rifle by a few degrees to keep the man from bolting. Information mattered more than a clear line of fire. "What temple?" I said. "What wardens?" Between half-swallowed fragments and prayers for protection, he told me enough. The Temple of the Still, the governing body of Threshold. The Pal had become God, or something close enough that the distinction didn't matter to the people kneeling at its altars. The dark glass figures were saints, willingly translated, chosen. I let him go. He ran, and I didn't stop him. The nearest wall panel woke as he passed it. The dark glass brightened from within and held a brief impression of his palm after he pushed through the emergency door, 5 pale lines sinking slowly into black. Then a second light appeared beneath them, gold. My armor registered a low paracausal echo traveling through the panel and outward into the tower's network. The saints were wired into the city. I stood in that corridor, surrounded by glass panels that I now understood were remains, the converted bodies of the faithful, mounted on walls like sacred art, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. This city had given itself to a church. I moved through the mid-city levels with the fusion rifle under a maintenance tarp and my pauldrons wrapped in insulating cloth. The disguise wouldn't survive close inspection, but in the dim corridors of the residential wards, it bought me distance. The temple's influence was everywhere. Translation shrines at every major intersection, small altars of dark glass where people left personal items, scraps of food, sometimes small cuts of their own blood on cloth strips. Public screens mounted on corridor walls displayed sermons and announcements, and above the sermons, countdown timers. Numbers ticking down toward an event the screens called the final translation. I read the words but didn't understand them yet. One screen changed as I passed. The sermon vanished, replaced by a figure in old order armor. Temple notice, the text read. Paracausal contaminant detected. Do not approach. Report golden emissions. The people beneath it looked up together. I was already beyond them when they began turning toward the tarp over my rifle. I understood the ceremony, though. I came around a corner into a major concourse, a wide public space spanning 3 levels, crossed by walkways, and I walked into a crowd. 200 people, maybe more, gathered around a raised platform in the concourse center. On the platform stood a young man, mid-20s, healthy, fit, smiling. A priest in dark robes stood beside him, speaking words that the crowd's murmuring drowned before they reached me. The young man knelt. The priest pressed a shard of dark glass against his chest, just below the collarbone. The translation started at the contact point and spread outward. A black tide converting flesh into crystal, moving across his torso, down his arms, up his neck. His fingers locked into place. His expression froze in something that looked like relief, or the memory of it. In less than 10 seconds he was glass, dark, cold, luminous inside, a statue kneeling on a platform, and the crowd around him broke into applause. I did not intervene. He'd chosen this. The crowd was celebrating. Whatever was happening to this city, the people in it were not prisoners. I kept moving. The Order's safe house was where I remembered it, behind a false wall in a decommissioned maintenance shaft, 14 levels below the concourse. The entrance hadn't been opened in centuries. Dust coated everything inside in a grey film. But the door still responded to my paracausal signature, the lock recognizing energy it hadn't tasted since before these people's ancestors were born. Inside, racks of depleted ammunition, a field kit with expired medical compounds, a tactical console buried under grey dust, and a message, cued in the console's memory, recorded by Commander Raymond Foss. The last Parallax Knight stationed in Threshold. He'd recorded it roughly 800 years ago, city relative, and the console had been waiting all that time for a Knight's signature to trigger playback. Foss appeared on the console's display, a hard-faced man, late 40s, wearing armor that looked like an older model of mine. His 12-minute recording was a concise, unsentimental soldier's report to whoever came after him. The Knights kept transiting, kept fighting the Paul's fleet in the void beyond settled space, kept not coming back. Casualty rates were brutal. Some wormholes didn't deliver their passengers at all. Ships that entered one side simply never emerged from the other. The city waited. 50 years, 100, 200. The forge's maintenance crews shrank as the technical knowledge required to service it eroded, generation by generation. A former forge engineer named Aldous Harker began preaching that the PAL was a natural force beyond morality, that opposing it was arrogance, that peace could be had through acceptance. The city held a vote. It was still a democracy then, and chose to stop fighting. The attacks stopped immediately. Foss described what followed. The first voluntary translations within a decade. The dissenters translated by force, the only involuntary conversions, and they happened early, before the faith took root deeply enough to sustain itself without coercion. After that, everything was willing. The temple rose, the wardens formed, the Order's insignia was scraped off every wall, and the word burner entered the vocabulary as something between a curse and a ghost story. His final warning, the forge was engineered to last roughly 1,500 years without major overhaul. The knowledge to perform that overhaul died with the last generation of forge engineers. In 800 years, it would fail. The temple knew this. They were planning for it. Foss had attached one engineering file. The idol appeared as a black interruption through the suppression grid, built over the forge's primary grounding trunk, and fed by the translated structures wired into the city. It was a bridge holding the boundary open through the dying forge. The Order had broken smaller bridges by saturating them at contact with wormhole energy. Transit stored that energy in a Knight's body. Armor only shaped it, and without another gate passage it could not be replaced. Foss's final annotation was brief. If the main conduit is complete, surface strikes will not be enough. A full reserve discharge may sever it. Permanent depletion probable. I cross-referenced Foss's timeline with the countdown on the public screens. The final translation was a scheduled operation. The temple's priests were going to shut down the forge's remaining output in a coordinated ritual. When the forge died, the suppression field that held the Pol's influence at bay would collapse. The entire planet would undergo translation. Every living person in Threshold would become dark glass. The countdown showed less than 9 hours. I was cataloguing the safe house's remaining supplies. 2 functional shield cells, a backup power cell for the fusion rifle at 60% charge, a combat blade with a paracausal edge. I seated 1 shield cell in my left gauntlet and locked the second against my belt. The tactical console flashed as the gauntlet came alive. My signature had gone out through the legacy grid, answered by 1,000 points in the modern one. The safe house had recognized me. So had the city. The wall behind me blew inward. 4 wardens came through the breach. Their armor was dark glass over metal, translucent black plating that caught the safe house's emergency lighting and threw it back in distorted angles. They carried projectile weapons loaded with glass shard ammunition, and 2 of them held short swords with blades that looked like frozen smoke. The first one fired before the dust settled. Glass shrapnel tore across the room, and I got the kinetic shield up, a wall of compressed force that bloomed from my left gauntlet in a wash of golden light. The shards hit the shield and shattered into powder. I brought the fusion rifle up with my right hand and put a plasma bolt through the lead warden's chest plate. Thermal shock. The glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern, then blew apart. He went backward into the man behind him, and they both hit the corridor wall. The third came from my left, sword high. I collapsed the shield and reformed it as a blade edge along my forearm, caught his strike, and redirected it into the floor. The glass sword bit into the deck plating and stuck. I hit him with a kinetic burst, an open palm projection that threw him across the safe house and into the far wall hard enough to crater the metal behind him. He didn't get up. The fourth had circled behind me during the exchange. His sword caught the gap between my shoulder plates and drove in. Cold, a deep, invasive cold that burned inward and kept burning, spreading through the muscle tissue around the wound. I felt my flesh begin to stiffen. The translation was trying to start, using the glass blade as a seed crystal. I grabbed his wrist, twisted until something in it broke, and tore the blade out of my shoulder. The wound was blackened at the edges, the skin crystalline, spreading. I burned the translation back with paracausal energy, golden heat flooding the wound, searing the dark crystal into inert dust, and it cost me more than it should have. My reserves were lower than I'd thought. I put the last warden down with a knee strike that folded his glass chest plate inward and dropped him. The safe house was compromised. 9 hours on the clock and shrinking. 1 target, the idol at the base of the forge's spire, the ritual's conduit. Destroy the idol, sever the connection, and the forge stabilizes at whatever diminished output it can still manage. The city lives. I armed myself, left the dead behind, and started moving toward the city's core. The garrison district occupied the mid-city band that had been the Parallax Order's barracks and training grounds. I'd sparred in these corridors 1,000 years ago, running combat drills with men and women whose names I still remembered and whose descendants now worshipped the enemy we'd trained to fight. The architecture told 2 stories at once. The bones were order standard, reinforced corridors with interlocking fire positions, blast-rated doors at every junction, overhead gantries designed for mobile defense, but the surfaces had been transformed. Dark glass reinforcements along every wall, translation shrines in the old sparring halls, the Order's crossed lance insignia chipped away and replaced with the black circle consuming its flame. Banners hung where tactical displays used to be. I came in hard. The wardens were already mobilizing, and the dead squad's communications silence told them everything they needed to know. I fired the fusion rifle from 60 meters and blew the first checkpoint apart before the guards behind it could raise their weapons. Glass and metal fragmented outward. I stepped through the smoke and kept moving. The wardens fought in squads of 4 to 6, coordinated, disciplined, capable. They used the corridor layout against me, overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions, squad rotations that kept fresh fighters in front while the wounded pulled back. 2 senior wardens in the first major engagement could project localized cold from their gauntlets, creating zones in the corridor where the temperature dropped far enough to slow my movement and drain my kinetic shield faster. I pushed through it by dumping energy, shield flaring gold against the cold, each second of contact burning reserves I couldn't replace. At the first junction, they gave me an opening. 3 riflemen abandoned the forward barricade and ran toward the old equipment hall, one of them dragging a leg. I followed for 6 steps before I recognized the withdrawal pattern. 3rd Lance had called it an open hand. Let an attacker see the wounded, let him close on the palm, then break every finger around him. The blast doors dropped behind me. Firing shutters opened on both walls. The first volley turned the shield gold-white. The senior wardens drove cold into the field while the riflemen I had chased pivoted and fired. My new shield cell fell to 40% before I reached the nearest shutter. I put my damaged shoulder into the wall and felt the sword wound tear open. My first kinetic strike glanced off. A glass shard came through the thinning shield above my right knee, and the leg folded when I loaded it again. The old overhead gantry was still where I remembered. I shot its forward support. Cable tray and maintenance grating came down on the wardens behind the left wall, breaking their projection. I turned the shield toward the right, crossed the kill box, and drove a kinetic burst through the shutter. Metal and the 2 men behind it folded inward. The blast doors reopened. I stepped into the main corridor with the shard in my thigh and the shield cell pulsing red. The next time they offered ground, I burned the route instead of taking it. 12 wardens went down in the first defensive position. I took glass fragments in my right thigh, a cold burn across my left forearm that spread the dark crystalline residue further up toward my elbow, and a concussive hit from a breaching charge that rattled my skull inside the helmet. Each wound was manageable. The accumulation was the problem. The second position was worse. They'd had time to prepare. Barricades of translated matter, heavy enough to absorb plasma bolts without shattering. I had to close the distance and break through with kinetic projections at close range, which meant taking fire from glass shard rifles at 10 meters. My chest plate held. My left pauldron didn't. A concentrated volley cracked it, and I felt shrapnel bite into the muscle beneath. I killed the riflemen with a kinetic sweep that threw them into their own barricade hard enough to break the translation barrier apart, and walked through the gap over their bodies. The inner compound, the old Order command center, where I'd received my first deployment orders. The room was large, circular, built around a central holographic display that no longer functioned. The Order's tactical maps were gone, replaced by temple iconography and a massive dark glass relief depicting the final translation as a moment of collective transcendence. A city of figures ascending into blackness, their faces blissful. Desmond Tull was waiting for me in the center of the room. He was a big man, mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing the heaviest dark glass plate armor I'd seen. Full coverage, layered, with a cold channeling array built into his gauntlets that gave off visible distortion waves, the air around his hands blurring like heat haze in reverse. He held a 2-handed sword of solid dark glass, and he held it like he knew how to use it. "You killed 26 of my people getting here," he said. His voice was controlled, the way a commander sounds when he's already made his decisions and is simply informing you of the terms. "I'll kill more if you don't step aside." "I know you will." He shifted his grip on the sword. "You're what they said you'd be. A burner, a relic from the old war. You people started this, you know. The pile was dormant until your Order began punching holes in the void with those wormholes. Every transit tore the boundary wider. Every campaign made the enemy stronger." He came at me mid-sentence. The transition from speech to violence was seamless, a man who used conversation as tactical positioning. The glass sword swept low, targeting my damaged right leg, and I caught it on the kinetic shield. The impact was heavier than it should have been. Cold radiated from the blade through the shield and into my arm. Tull's channeling array was feeding the Paul's energy directly into his weapon. I fired the fusion rifle one-handed. He pivoted inside the bolt's path. Fast for a man his size, trained, reading my aim before I'd fully committed. And the plasma scorched the wall behind him. He closed the distance and drove the pommel of his sword into my cracked pauldron. Pain detonated through my shoulder. I dropped, rolled, came up with the rifle braced and fired twice. He blocked the first bolt with the flat of his blade. The glass absorbed the heat, darkened, held, and sidestepped the second. "My mother chose the glass," he said, circling. I held her hand while the translation took her. She smiled. "Do you understand that? She was at peace. You come here with your fire and arrogance, killing my soldiers to stop the rest of this city from finding what she found." He lunged again. I dropped the shield and met him with a kinetic burst channeled through my fist, a close-range detonation of compressed force that hit his chest plate at the point of contact. The glass cracked in a starburst pattern. He staggered. I hit him again, same spot, and the plate shattered inward. He swung the sword in a defensive arc, and I caught the blade between my gauntlets, paracausal energy flaring gold against the dark glass, and snapped it. The broken blade clattered across the floor. Tull dropped to one knee, one hand pressed against his shattered chest plate, where dark glass fragments had been driven inward toward his ribs. Blood seeped between his fingers. Real blood. He looked up at me with an expression I recognized from the battlefield. Pure assessment. A man determining whether he can still fight. He couldn't. We both knew it. I stepped past him and left him alive. The reason was complicated. He was a soldier who believed he was defending his home. His mother chose the glass and he'd held her hand. The final translation still had to be stopped. Killing him as he knelt on the floor of a room where I'd once learned to fight would serve nothing. The garrison was behind me. The inner city was ahead. Through the compound's rear windows, the forge's light had shifted from dull red to something darker, a deep, angry crimson that throbbed at the edges of visibility, each beat a little weaker than the last. I checked the countdown on a wall-mounted screen as I passed through the compound's exit corridor. 7 hours and 12 minutes. The numbers ticked down as I watched. I moved toward the core. The inner city was a museum of the willing dead. Entire building facades had been converted, whole walls of dark glass where brick and metal used to be, the crystalline surface swallowing what remained of the forge's reddened light. I walked through streets lined with translated figures. Hundreds of them, standing in rows, sitting on benches, posed in doorways. Someone had arranged them with care. Families holding hands, frozen together. A man sitting at a workstation, tools still in his glass fingers. 2 boys, mid-stride, captured in a foot race they would run forever. A father reading to a small child, the child's head tipped against the father's arm, both of them dark and luminous and still. The trapped light inside them shifted as I passed, drifting through their glass bodies like something aware. Thousands of faint interior movements stirred through a district where the forge's glow barely reached. My armor's thermal systems were redlining. My breath crystallized in the air, each exhalation forming fine ice that drifted down rather than dissipating. Gravity felt wrong, heavier in some corridors, lighter in others, subtle shifts that threw off my balance and made familiar movements feel like they belonged to someone else's body. Frost formed on the translated figures in angular patterns, almost structural, as if the cold itself was building something from the raw material of the dead. A cluster of people appeared at the end of a residential corridor. 4 of them, an old man, 2 younger adults, and a boy of 12 or 13. All 4 were unconverted, waiting. The old man sat on a bench beside a translation shrine, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes on the ground. One of the younger men stood with his arms crossed, watching me approach with open hostility. The other sat beside the old man, staring at nothing. The boy stood apart from all of them, leaning against the corridor wall. "Where's the forge spire from here?" I said. "The fastest route down." The hostile one stepped forward. "You're too late, Burner. The final translation will take us before you ever reach the altar. We'll be at peace, and you'll freeze in the dark where you belong." The old man wouldn't look at me. The seated younger man ignored me as if I were weather happening to someone else. But the boy was staring at my armor, at the golden traces on my gauntlets, at the fusion rifle, at the order's insignia on my chest plate, which I hadn't scraped off because it was mine and I'd earned it. His expression was difficult to read. Recognition, maybe. Or the memory of a picture he'd seen somewhere he wasn't supposed to be looking. He pointed down a corridor to my left, said nothing. I followed his direction without comment, and as I turned the corner, I heard the hostile man telling the boy he'd burn for that the burner was a demon sent to deny them the translation, and the boy didn't answer. The corridor dropped steeply into the lower levels, closer to the forge's spire. 2 transit junctions, both unguarded. The warden's perimeter was closer to the temple district, not out here among the faithful and the dead. I moved fast, covering ground, conserving what I could. The elite wardens found me at the temple district's outer ring. These were different from the garrison soldiers. Their armor was more glass than metal. Plates of dark crystal fitted over a minimal frame, bonded to the body beneath in ways that suggested the armor had been grown into place. Several of them had undergone partial translation themselves. One had a left arm of solid dark glass from shoulder to fingertip, the joints still functional, the crystal surface radiating visible cold. Another's torso was half converted, the glass merged with flesh along a jagged boundary that crept up his neck. They fought differently. The partially translated ones projected freezing fields from their converted limbs, expanding zones of killing cold that I could see as distortions in the air, the moisture crystallizing into geometric frost patterns at the boundary. They felt no pain. A plasma bolt cracked the glass arm of the first one I engaged, and he kept swinging, the shattered limb reforming behind the break, knitting itself back together with dark crystal that pulled from the walls and floor. I killed him by channeling paracausal energy through the combat blade and driving it through the glass at his sternum. The golden heat met the dark crystal and the reaction was violent. The glass didn't just break but detonated outward from the wound, taking most of his chest cavity with it. He collapsed in pieces. The paracausal expenditure left my vision swimming. 2 more came from a side corridor. I caught the first with a kinetic burst that threw him into the wall, then took the second's freezing field full on while I closed the distance. The cold hit my shield and ate through it in seconds. Golden light guttering, dying, the field collapsing from the edges inward. I got inside the field's radius before the shield failed completely and put the blade through his converted torso. The detonation was smaller this time. My reserves were draining. The third engagement cost me the first replacement shield cell entirely. 3 elite wardens in a coordinated assault, channeling cold from multiple directions, boxing me into an intersection where the temperature dropped so far that ice formed on my armor plates in the time it took me to cross the gap. The fusion rifle's power cell was at half. I fired 4 times, putting bolts through 2 of them, and finished the third with the blade at close quarters. Cold cracked my left gauntlet during the exchange, contracting the metal faster than the seals could compensate. The crystalline spread on my forearm had crept past my elbow now. A stripe of dark glass fused into my flesh, inert at the surface but cold all the way down to the bone. When I tried to eject the dead cell, the glass in my arm resisted the turn of my wrist. I used the heel of my other hand to force the joint around, drove the last shield cell into place, and got a weak gold plane to form. The cell was my last. Less movement in the arm every minute. I reached a high walkway overlooking the central plaza. Below me, I saw the idol for the first time. It was immense. A column of fused dark glass rising from the plaza floor, 40 or 50 meters tall, its surface covered with the compressed shapes of thousands of translated bodies. I could see them, arms reaching from the mass, faces locked in expressions of devotion or surrender, torsos merged into the collective structure, all of it fused together into a single unbroken spire of dark crystal that reached toward the forge above like a hand grasping for the dying sun. Around its base, priests in dark robes moved between ceremonial stations. Lines of the faithful waited in orderly queues, kneeling at intervals, ready for their final translation. The forge above the spire was barely brighter than the idol beneath it. A deep, injured red, its light irregular, dimming and recovering in stutters like a heart losing its rhythm. Between me and the idol stood the Temple of the Still. The temple had been the forge's control facility before it became a cathedral. I could see the engineering bones beneath the religious surface. Coolant conduits repurposed as reliquary channels. Service panels buried under altars of dark glass. The massive primary control interface still visible on the far wall. Its displays dead. Its manual inputs draped in black ceremonial cloth. The ceiling rose high enough that the forge's weakened light filtered down through gaps, casting the interior in shades of dark amber. The inner guard hit me at the entrance. 6 of them, the most converted wardens I'd seen. Bodies more glass than flesh, moving fast. The first 2 channeled cold through the reliquary system. They drove their hands into the channels built along the walls, and the whole temple answered. Frost raced through the old coolant conduits beneath the altars. A field closed across the nave from both sides, fed by hundreds of dark glass fragments arranged in the channels like electrical cells. My shield bowed inward. The last replacement cell began losing charge faster than the display could count it. I fired into the left channel. The bolt disappeared into a reliquary. Faces surfaced in its brightening glass for a fraction of a second. Closed eyes, the impression of mouths, and the cold field grew stronger. The wardens advanced behind it. I gave ground toward the entrance. One crossed the distance in 3 rigid steps and hit my right side with a converted forearm. The armor plates went black from the point of contact. Their weight changed before their shape did, dragging me sideways. A second warden caught my rifle barrel, and ice spread down the casing toward my hand. I triggered the weapon against his chest. Glass and plasma burst between us. He came apart. I went through the nearest altar station and hit the floor under a rain of translated fragments. The temple's engineering bones were exposed beneath the broken altar. 3 coolant trunks ran under it towards the primary control wall. The center trunk was wrapped in dark glass and feeding the field. I could cut it. I could also read the faded forge warning stamped into the metal beneath the crystal. Primary thermal return. Do not isolate under load. The remaining wardens were already closing. My shield cell dropped below 10%. I put 2 fusion bolts into the trunk. The first stripped away the glass. The second ruptured the metal beneath. Supercooled vapor punched across the nave, opaque and hard enough to throw one warden off his feet. The reliquary field failed. So did half the temple's lights. Far overhead, the forge dimmed to brown and stayed there for 3 long beats before struggling back to red. I crossed while the wardens were blind. The blade broke the converted spine of the nearest and detonated the glass through his torso. I caught another below the ribs and drove him into the second altar station, shattering its channel. I killed the last 2 before they reached the exposed trunk. The power cell had dropped below a quarter. A freezing strike had converted 2 plates across my right side. They cracked under their own altered weight, and I tore them off, leaving the underlayer exposed. The cold bit in immediately. Behind me, vapor continued pouring from the trunk I had ruptured. The forge did not recover its previous rhythm. I killed the last of them at the foot of the primary control interface and looked up to find Father Martin Webb standing 10 meters away, watching me. He was in his 60s, thin, calm. He wore simple dark robes without glass ornamentation, and he stood with his hands visible at his sides, making no move toward a weapon. He regarded me the way a physician regards an unusual symptom, with interest, concern, and professional distance. "Grant Hadley," he said. "3rd Lance, Parallax Order. Transit designation, November 7. You left Threshold 1142 years ago to join the Deep Void campaign against the Pul's outer fleet. I kept the fusion rifle trained on him. How do you know my name? The transit records survived. Every night whoever left through our gates is documented. You're the last one we expected to come back." He paused. "Although expected isn't quite right. No one expected any of you, not for centuries. Step away from the controls. I'll step aside. I'm not a soldier, Knight Hadley." He moved to the side, his hands still visible, and sat on the edge of a broken altar. The control interface behind him showed rows of manual inputs beneath the ceremonial drapery. the Forge's shutdown sequence. I've been watching your progress through the city. You killed competent men to reach this room. I've had hours to prepare for this conversation, and I chose to stay. You chose wrong. You may be right, but I thought you deserved to understand what you're about to destroy. He folded his hands. Do you know why the Knights failed? We fought to the end. You fought bravely, yes, for centuries, and every time you transited a wormhole, you tore the boundary between our space and the Parl's domain a little wider. Your aggression invited the Parl into our city, Knight Hadley. Every campaign, every transit, every victory you celebrated in your 4 subjective years of war, each one strengthened the very force you were trying to destroy. I didn't lower the rifle. The Parl attacked this city. The Parl responded to aggression. When we stopped aggressing, it stopped responding. That is an empirical fact. The 1,000 years since have been Threshold's most stable, peaceful period, free from attacks, fleet engagements, and casualties. That was actual peace, earned through the simple act of laying down arms that should never have been raised. And the translations? The people turned to glass? Chose to be turned to glass. Webb spoke like a man who had made this argument many times and believed it each time. I've studied the translated, Knight Hadley. Neural activity persists in the crystal matrix. Low-level, sustained, constant. The translated persist, suspended in a state that no instrument we possess can fully characterize, but which shows every indication of continuity. They may be experiencing something we cannot imagine. At minimum, they are free from suffering. You're killing them. I'm saving them. The Forge's death is an engineering certainty. 1,500 years without overhaul, and the knowledge to overhaul it died with the last generation that understood it. In a decade, perhaps 2, the Forge fails regardless of what either of us does today. When it fails, the planet freezes. Every living person in Threshold dies, slowly, painfully, watching the light go out. The final translation offers an alternative. We go together as a civilization, preserved whole and at peace. The argument had weight. I could feel it pressing against the simple version of events I'd been carrying since the safe house. Destroy the idol, save the city. Webb was an educated man making a sober, rational case for collective mercy in the face of inevitable extinction. And the worst part was that his engineering was probably right. The Forge was dying. I could see it dying through the gaps in the temple's ceiling, each stutter of its light a little weaker than the one before. The idol is a conduit, I said. It's pulling the Parl in, feeding it. The idol is a monument to the faithful who chose translation. It connects us to the Parl, yes. That connection is what makes the final translation possible. A single coordinated event rather than a slow, agonized freeze. And if I destroy it? Then the conduit breaks, the Forge stabilizes at a fraction of its former output, and the city survives. Webb said this without distress, as if he'd already considered the possibility and accepted it as a variant outcome. For a time, a decade, perhaps 2. Then the Forge fails anyway. The people you save today die screaming in the cold, one by one, beyond the reach of monuments, mercy, or translation. I had no answer for that. I'm a soldier. Arguments aren't part of my kit. My kit holds a rifle and a blade. Training tells me how to use both. Standing in the wreckage of his temple, bleeding from wounds that were turning to glass, I couldn't tell him he was wrong about the Forge. The translated remained an uncertainty beyond my ability to resolve. All I had was the memory of the Parl's fleet in the void, the dark ships whose only answer was consumption. Whatever the Parl was at its edges, where it touched the settled universe and wore a gentle face, at its center it was annihilation. But I couldn't say that in a way that would change his mind, and I didn't have time to try. I came to destroy the idol, I said. That's what I'm going to do. Webb studied me. Then he said, quietly, I know what you intend. So I've already entered the shutdown sequence for the Forge. He gestured toward the control interface. The final translation was scheduled for tomorrow morning. I've moved it forward. The forge will fail completely in less than 2 hours. The temple's interior dimmed as he spoke. The amber light from the ceiling gaps shifted toward brown. The temperature dropped, a sudden, visceral plunge that I felt through my damaged armor, through the exposed underlayer on my right side, through the glass stripe on my forearm that conducted the cold deeper than flesh alone could carry it. Every hour you've spent fighting through this city, people have died, Webb said. My wardens, my faithful, caught in the crossfire of your assault. The damage you've caused to the infrastructure has already accelerated the forge's decline. I am accelerating the only mercy left to us, Knight Hadley. The faster the translation completes, the fewer people suffer because of what you've done. Without taking the rifle off him, I tore the ceremonial cloth from the primary interface beside me. The old layout was still underneath. Thermal return, suppression load, emergency restart. I entered the order override and felt the machine accept my paracausal signature. Then it rejected the abort. The idol's external lattice had priority over the failing suppression grid. I tried to isolate it through the controls. The projected result showed an immediate cascade. The forge going dark in 9 minutes instead of 2 hours. 2 coolant sectors were already dead. A third flashed with the location of the trunk I had ruptured, fighting my way into the room. I tried the restart anyway. The controls required flow the broken sector could no longer provide. The command failed, reset, and offered the same 2 surviving paths. Maintain shutdown and permit full coupling. Sever the external lattice at its physical root and accept reduced forge output. Every path ended in catastrophe, and the broken coolant trunk had closed off the last clean option. He stood and walked toward a side chamber, his hands still visible. He did not look back. I let him go. The idol remained the target. It always had been. The forge's light guttered overhead. Less than 2 hours. The countdown I'd been watching had just been cut by more than 5. I crossed the temple nave, stepped through the rear arch, and the central plaza opened before me. The idol dominated everything. Up close, the details destroyed whatever distance I'd maintained from the walkway above. Individual faces pressed against the glass surface from within. Eyes closed, mouths relaxed, locked in expressions of willful surrender. Hands reaching from the fused mass, fingers spread as if grasping for something just beyond the crystal wall. A child's form near the base, perfectly preserved, small and curled and still. The interior luminance was brighter now than anything else in the plaza. Thousands of trapped lights drifting and shifting inside the dark crystal, fed by the pole's growing influence as the forge's suppression field weakened. The plaza was full of people, hundreds of them kneeling around the idol's base, arranged in concentric rings that radiated outward across the stone. They were praying. Some had their eyes closed and their heads bowed. Others stared up at the idol with open devotion. Some were already beginning to convert, dark glass spreading up from the ground where their knees touched the stone, climbing their shins, their thighs. They welcomed it. The glass rose through them like water through cloth, and they let it come. The boy from the corridor was among them. The hostile man stood between him and the nearest access passage, extending an arm whenever the boy tried to edge past. The boy did not argue. He only watched the opening behind the man's shoulder while the man bent close and spoke into his ear. I hit the man's arm with a narrow kinetic pulse. It snapped aside. The boy dropped, rolled under the reaching hands of 2 kneeling women, and ran toward the edge of the plaza. The pulse cost more than it should have. The last shield cell dimmed in my gauntlet, compensating for a generator cracked by cold, and an arm that no longer conducted energy cleanly. The crowd stood between me and the idol. I waded into the crowd. I chose restraint, shoving people aside with kinetic bursts calibrated low enough to push without killing. Golden flashes of force that knocked the faithful out of my path. Some fell and stayed down. Others scrambled back to their knees and resumed praying. A few grabbed at my legs, my arms, my damaged armor, trying to pull me down, trying to hold me in place long enough for the translation to take me too. I tore free each time and kept moving. One man caught my wrist. He was middle-aged, partially translated, glass up to his waist, his upper body still flesh, his face wet. "I'm begging you," he said. "Don't take this from us. I'll see my wife again. She's in there. She's been in there for 6 years and I can feel her waiting." I pulled free and stepped past him. He called after me, but the words were lost in the crowd's murmuring, the low, sustained sound of 500 people praying for their own extinction. The pole fought for its idol. I was 20 meters from the base when the gravity shifted. The ground cracked beneath my boots, stone fracturing along lines that radiated from the idol's foundation, chunks of plaza flooring lifting from the surface and beginning to orbit the column in slow, grinding circles. The air compressed. My armor groaned under pressure that came from every direction at once, as if the pile was trying to fold me into a smaller version of myself. Behind me, one of the lifted slabs broke from orbit and swept toward the access passage. The boy had almost reached it. I caught the slab with a kinetic projection from the deadening gauntlet and changed its path by less than a meter. It struck the wall beside him and burst into stone fragments. He vanished through the dust on his own feet. The shield display fell to its last margin and did not recover. A translation field rolled outward from the idol in a wave, a visible wall of absolute cold that turned the air ahead of it to ice crystals and converted everything it touched. The wave hit my kinetic shield and the shield died instantly. Just collapsed, the golden energy snuffed out like a candle in deep water. I staggered. The cold reached through my armor and into the skin beneath, and I felt the translation start. The crystalline spread, jumping from my forearm to my bicep, racing up my shoulder, black glass converting living tissue into dark crystal. I burned it back. Paracausal energy flooding the affected areas, searing the crystal, forcing it into retreat. The effort cost me a quarter of my remaining reserves in a single exertion. The last wardens came, a final ring of defenders stationed at the idol's base. 5 of them, more glass than human. They hit me from 3 directions. I fought on instinct and diminishing resources. The fusion rifle firing its last bolts at contact range. Plasma detonating against glass armor, bodies coming apart in bursts of dark crystal and golden heat. The rifle's power cell hit 0 and the weapon went dead in my hands. I dropped it, drew the combat blade and closed with the remaining 3. The blade sang where paracausal energy met dark glass. A freezing strike across my back converted the rear armor plates. They cracked and fell away. I drove the blade through a warden's converted throat, and the detonation threw us both sideways. Rolling to my feet, I caught the next warden through the hip, with a rising cut that split his glass torso along the fault line between flesh and crystal. The last one hit me with a cold projection strong enough to freeze my right gauntlet solid. I shattered my own gauntlet against his skull, breaking both, and put the blade through his chest with my bare hand on the grip. He fell. I stood over him, breathing hard, stripped down to underlayer and fragments. My armor was mostly gone, translated plates broken off, structural pieces cracked, the left gauntlet intact but dim, the right a ruin of frozen metal and exposed fingers. The glass on my arm had spread to my shoulder. The blade in my hand was the last weapon I had, and the paracausal edge was guttering, the golden light thin and unreliable. The idol was right in front of me. Gravity doubled, then tripled. The pole bore down through its conduit with everything the dying suppression field could no longer hold back, and I went to my knees on the broken plaza stone. The weight was immense, my spine compressing, my joints grinding, my vision narrowing to a tunnel with the idol at its center. The cold was absolute. My remaining armor was translating, the left gauntlet turning black, the chest underlayer stiffening, my body heat being pulled out of me faster than biology could replace it. I dropped the blade, Under that weight, any movement that depended on muscle and bone had become impossible. Another force remained. I was a parallax knight. I'd transited wormholes that bent time and space around my body, and the residue of those transits was woven into every cell I had. Paracausal energy, the fundamental force of wormhole passage, the thing that let matter exist in two places at once, the violation of causality that the pole could not tolerate. I put both hands on the idol's surface. I channeled everything I had left into the contact point. Every transit, every campaign, every jump through every wormhole across 4 years of war. All of it compressed into a single sustained projection, golden white energy burning through my palms and into the dark glass. The idol resisted. The pole pushed back through its conduit, and for a moment the two forces held. Golden heat against black cold, the energy of passage against the energy of stillness, the war distilled to 2 hands on a wall of crystal. Then the idol fractured. A single crack deep inside, splitting upward from the contact point. Then another, branching from the first. Then dozens, hundreds, the fractures propagating through the fused mass faster than I could track, each one spilling light, paracausal light, raw and gold, burning through the dark crystal and illuminating the shapes inside. The faces, the hands, the child. All of them lit from within by the force that was tearing them apart. The idol split. The two halves separated with a sound like a glacier carving, and the detonation that followed was pure disintegration. Thousands of dark glass fragments blowing outward from the broken conduit, trailing golden sparks, scattering across the plaza in a rain of shattered crystal. The Powell's focused influence went with them. The gravity released. The cold broke. I fell forward onto the plaza stone, empty. The forge stabilized. I could see it through the clearing rubble, the light overhead shifting, the sickly brown-red brightening towards something warmer. Amber. Dim amber. Nothing close to the white gold I remembered, but steady. The suppression field reasserted itself at whatever reduced level the damaged forge could manage, and the translation fields across the plaza died. The ground-level cold eased, the gravity distortions settled. The translations in progress stopped. Some of the faithful around me were fully converted, dark glass statues kneeling in prayer, permanent, beyond rescue. Others were partially translated, the glass frozen mid-climb on their bodies, and they screamed or sat in stunned silence depending on how far the process had reached. Some were untouched, kneeling on the broken stone, staring at the space where their idol had been. I tried to stand and couldn't. My paracausal reserves were gone. Completely empty, a hollowness I'd never experienced in 4 years of combat. My armor was wreckage. The glass on my arm had stopped spreading, inert now without the pole's active influence, but it was part of me. A permanent stripe of dark crystal fused from shoulder to wrist, cold and black and mine. My right hand was bare and bloodied where the gauntlet had shattered. My ribs ached from the gravity compression. I'd fought my way through a city and spent everything I had on a wall of glass, and I was kneeling in the rubble like the faithful around me, just facing a different direction. I stood on the second try. My legs held, barely. The plaza was chaos. People were carrying the partially translated. Men and women with glass limbs, glass torsos. Their bodies caught between states and locked there. Others sat on the ground and wept. Priests wandered through the rubble, their ceremonial robes dusted with dark crystal fragments, their faces blank. At first the crowd offered neither resistance nor help. They looked at me the way you look at a natural disaster, something that happened impersonal and absolute. A shard rifle rose at the edge of the plaza. The warden holding it had lost most of his helmet and half the glass from one shoulder, but the barrel steadied on my chest. "Lower it," Toll said. He stood behind the warden with one arm bound across his shattered chest plate, blood dried black along the broken glass. His face held no gratitude. He looked past me at the crater, the screaming half-translated, the priests gathering nothing from the air with empty hands. "The field is gone," he said. "Get the living inside. Mark anyone translated above the chest for assisted breathing. Move the wounded." The rifle lowered. Wardens began lifting the wounded. Tull did not look at me again. The boy from the corridor was there, standing at the edge of the plaza, in the mouth of an access passage, watching. Same unreadable expression. The boy watched in silence while the amber light washed over the broken square, and the sound of weeping filled the spaces between the translated dead. I found the fusion rifle in the rubble. The power cell was spent, but the weapon was intact, the casing built to survive conditions worse than this. I slung it over my shoulder because it was mine, because it was the orders, because leaving it behind in a temple that had tried to kill the sun felt like the kind of surrender I wasn't ready to make. I walked out of the plaza, alone. Behind me, a priest knelt at the edge of the crater where the idol's base had been, and began collecting fragments of dark glass. The shattered remains of thousands of people who had chosen this, who had believed, who were now scattered across the stone in pieces the size of coins. He gathered them carefully, one at a time, the way someone gathers the pieces of something they intend to rebuild. The forge burned amber above the towers. It would hold for years, maybe decades. The city had time to decide what it wanted to be without the idol whispering in its foundations. Webb could preach 100 more sermons about the demon knight who denied them their salvation. I could reach the wormhole gate on the outer ring and see if any of them still functioned, if there were other knights out there in the dilated void, still fighting, still transiting, still tearing holes in the boundary between here and the dark. I didn't know if I'd saved anyone. The forge was burning and the people were breathing. Most of them wished I hadn't come. The man who'd wanted to see his wife in the glass was sitting on the broken plaza floor, staring at the space where she'd been, and he would hate me for the rest of his natural years. Webb was alive somewhere in the temple, composing the sermon that would make me the worst thing that had ever happened to this city, and a percentage of the population, a large percentage, would believe every word. The pal was still out there, older than the species that had tried to fight it, and the species that had tried to worship it. The forge was still dying, just slower. I'd bought time, which was the only currency a parallax knight had ever dealt in. Whether it was enough depended on people I didn't know making choices I couldn't predict in a city that considered me a monster. I walked through the towers in amber light with an empty rifle slung over my shoulder, a blade with no edge at my side. The glass in my arm caught the forge's glow and held it, dark crystal cradling a sliver of borrowed warmth, neither consuming it nor letting it go.